want to start out by thanking our generous funders. You see them listed on the screen, in addition to the wonderful foundations that are listed there. CHN members and supporters help us to do this work. So thank you very much for that. You can go to the next slide, Leo. Today's presenters, we're just so fortunate. Before I mention them, I do want to say at the outset that this webinar is not intended for press. Our speakers' remarks are off the record. Please don't send sort of quotes from them out on social media. But we want you to have them, and you are very fortunate, we all are, to be hearing from these great experts. Ellen Nissenbaum, the Senior Advisor, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, is going to talk, sort of give us some grounding at the beginning for the strategies that advocates should be thinking about employing, how to use the budget rules that you're going to hear about. We also are so delighted that in the interest of family values, first ever for CHN, a father-son duo, Richard Kogan, Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and Bobby Kogan, Senior Director, Federal Budget Policy Center for American Progress. Both of them have astounding and wonderfully varied experience, not only in their independent organizations, analyst role, but in previous experience in both Office of Management and Budget in the White House at different times. Richard on the House Budget Committee, Bobby on the Senate Budget Committee. So you couldn't have more wonderful experts who will be starting their presentations in a minute. So, you know, about 1,000 people have registered all for this webinar. We know that the new Congress is intent on using the budget rules for a very particular advantage, being able to pass budget-related legislation with just a simple majority in the Senate instead of needing 60 votes. So it does seem like a good idea to understand these rules, but we know we need them to plan our advocacy strategies. Again, to remind you, every registrant will get the recording of the webinar, plus the slides you'll be seeing and some other resources. We expect to be able to send that out tomorrow. With that, I think we can, thank you for stopping sharing. And I want to introduce, with the warmest good feelings, Ellen Nissenbaum to start us out with that strategic framing. Ellen, thank you.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to kick off the hottest ticket in town, the Kogan and Kogan Roadshow. I think they're already being booked on comedy, the Daily Comedy Hour, for an episode very nearby. So you should feel lucky you're seeing the, what do they call it when they model a TV show? This is it. Very grateful to Debbie and Leo and CHN. We have been getting a million, maybe a bazillion questions at the Center on Budget, Richard and I and the team, about reconciliation and the Byrd Rule and this and that. And I know Bobby has taken a lot of that as well. Really appreciate the work Bobby's done and his terrific piece putting it out. We've been through a lot of reconciliations at the Center on Budget back since the 80s. And I know it can seem as a very intimidating process. It's hard to understand, and it may feel like it's hard to impact. And often we get drawn to understanding in minutia, and sometimes I worry that we are missing the forest by only focusing on the trees. There is no one in the world to unpack it, to simplify it as best they can, and most importantly, to help you focus on what's really important in reconciliation and what's not important for us to know. We know that a bill like reconciliation, especially in this moment, in this context, it's hard to stop, right? But I think there are really important opportunities to influence reconciliation, but knowing the process, I think, will help lift those up, and then we can come back and kind of think about those opportunities. I do want to flag that next week, the center will release what I think is a really important tool for advocates, which is what to look for in the budget. It is directly related to what Richard will talk about. It's a little bit of a roadmap about what to look for in the budget, what are the things that matter, and how does it really give us a sense of how reconciliation will flow from this. Now, I think most of you know you can only do reconciliation when the same party controls both chambers and they can produce a final budget resolution. And there's a positive element here and an element that is, I think, very frustrating for many of us, as we know. The budget resolution, as you know, is not a law. We tend to think about it as a top-line roadmap of fiscal priorities. I think it is very much a moral document about our priorities as a country. It isn't a document that provides you with policy specifics. It's not a law. It doesn't do that. So the budget resolution isn't going to tell us exactly what changes they're making in Medicaid, or exactly which tax cuts are going to be on the table, or what changes they're making to the child tax credit. It's just not going to give us that information. And I know that's very frustrating. But I'm worried about the number of folks that have said to me, but, Ellen, we're not going to really be able to do anything until they've actually introduced and are moving their reconciliation bills. I don't think that's the case. I think there are important things we learn from the budget about reconciliation. There is going to be a gap between the budget and when committees mark up reconciliation, and then again on the floor. And with these narrow margins, each and every opportunity we have to impact that is really important. And there are those opportunities in reconciliation, even though we have to acknowledge it will be, I think, extremely difficult, would be the way to stop these reconciliation bills from passing. But it's really important to understand a budget resolution and reconciliation instructions do not make the reconciliation bill a done deal. There are some very difficult things they will have to go through in narrowing down the policy specifics, and in a world where they don't have votes to spare, being able to get everybody on board. So we are living at the center from our President Sharon Parrott with a real guidance that we need to block what we can block. But if we can't block it, we may be able to mitigate the damage. And I think reconciliation does offer us that opportunity. So here's an example. A lot of us are very focused right now on one huge threat, huge threat in reconciliation, which exists whether or not they do tax in round one or round two. And that is an issue that actually now a bunch of Republicans are publicly saying they want to do, and that are cuts and changes in Medicaid and SNAP. And they are very much a threat in the first round, even if tax comes later. So there's some new Republican intelligence that Eileen and I have picked up that the first bill may well include Medicaid work requirements. We don't have any indication about SNAP yet, and repealing some really important Biden Medicaid regs. And that would save a significant amount of money. Now, the budget resolution won't tell us that. But the budget resolution, as Richard will explain, can give us some important signals, indications, numbers that allow us to say they are going after SNAP, they are going after Medicaid. And we will help people do that so we understand our opportunity to engage, to lift up, to start moving forward starts with a budget resolution, not when we see the reconciliation bill. I also want to note that there's often a lot of attention, an enormous amount of energy that goes into when the Senate reconciliation bill reaches the floor. It's a process called vote-a-rama, and Bobby will be enormously helpful here in unpacking that. I want to say I frankly think there's often too much attention and too much energy given the reality of vote-a-rama. The opportunity to impact and influence reconciliation is before vote-a-rama, not really on the floor. It is very, very difficult to change a reconciliation bill in the Senate, but it is an opportunity to lift up contrasts. It is an opportunity to offer amendments to show what the policy should be, not what they're putting on the table. So there are strategic opportunities to use it, but we really need to not go into this thinking it's not going to be a good bill, but we'll try to change it on the Senate floor. This is obviously a process that's focused on the Senate. The House very unhappily understands that the Senate reconciliation rules effectively bind them. So what passes muster in the Senate, it doesn't matter whether the House could do something different. That is the only thing that can be in the Senate, in the final reconciliation bill. And as Richard reminds me over and over again, the Rules Committee in the House serves at the pleasure of the Speaker, and the Speaker can tell the Rules Committee to do whatever he wants. They can do whatever they want on reconciliation and anything else. The last thing I want to say is, when we tend to hear reconciliation, like a chill goes down your spine, right? I just want to remind us that reconciliation has been a tool that we have used to make enormous positive improvements. The ACA, the CTC, the EITC. So this isn't that moment, but we want to understand reconciliation, because at some point we hope that there will be an opportunity for us to use reconciliation to push through really important improvements that help people and make sure that people have the opportunity to thrive. So it's a dark moment now, but it is an opportunity to learn about this and think about how it offers us opportunities down the road. So with that, I'll turn it back to Debbie.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That is a good reminder. I think some of you may have heard various terms, and reconciliation may very well be one of them that you don't really fully understand. And that's why we're going to turn to our two wonderful expert speakers in a second. Let me just remind people, some of you have been putting your questions in the Q&A box. That's the most helpful place for them, so we can see them quickly. And so I will just remind people to do that. Ellen, since you can stay on, I think we'll hold questions till the very end, but we will be sure to get to them. So remember, use the Q&A box for questions. I'll write them down. We'll share as many as we can. Okay, so you've heard a bunch of terms. You're not familiar with all those terms. Richard, please start us out in the explanations.
Thank you very much. I'd be glad to. I'm sorry that this discussion is largely a combination of a vocabulary lesson and a lesson of obscure arcane rules that don't affect your real life, but they do affect real legislation. And that's why everything that Ellen said was really vital. Okay, here we go. Reconciliation, slide 1. Reconciliation affects spending.
Can I hold just for a second, because I'm not, okay, here come the slides.
Okay, next slide, please. Reconciliation affects spending, revenue, and the debt limit to the extent that Congress wants it to. It offers procedural advantages in the Senate because reconciliation bills cannot be filibustered, so it takes only a majority vote to pass them. It follows unique rules. It's hard to amend, as Ellen pointed out. First of all, there are germaneness requirements. If you're offering an amendment on the floor, it must be directly germane to material that's already in the bill. And secondly, there is the Byrd rule, and boy, will we get to that later, but it prohibits all sorts of provisions from being in the original bill or in amendments. And Bobby lived in the Senate and therefore understands and will explain all of this. As Ellen points out, it has been used for major legislation. Back in the 80s and early 90s, this was invariably legislation designed to reduce projected deficits. But it's not always used this way. The Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, the Trump tax cuts in 2017, the 2021 Rescue Plan, and the 2021 Inflation Reduction Act all increased deficits temporarily temporarily, but substantially. Okay, what is it that reconciliation can't do? Next slide. It cannot make changes to Social Security law. It cannot make changes that don't score We'll get more into that later, but that means it can't make changes that don't affect spending, revenue, or the debt limit. So it can't create or change budget process rules. It can't, for example, impose caps on future appropriations. That doesn't score because only future appropriations are scored as spending. It cannot increase deficits in the long term. Those are the decades after the years covered by the reconciliation directive, the reconciliation window, which are usually 10 years, and we expect they will likely be 10 years in this go-around. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about the generic reconciliation process from the beginning. First, as Ellen pointed out, you need a budget resolution, and a budget resolution needs to be a concurrent resolution agreement between the House and the Senate. It does not take the president's signature because it's not a law. It is a blueprint for action on the budget. The budget resolution may, but need not, contain reconciliation directives. In this case, we say, oh, of course it will. The budget resolution reconciliation directives name certain committees, specified committees, and give those committees dollar targets and a reporting date, a non-binding reporting date. And that's all the reconciliation directives do. So reading a reconciliation directive cannot tell you what they're planning to do. There you have to read everything else. Second, the reconciled committees will then draft and report legislation that complies with the reconciliation directive that each reconciled committee got. Third, the budget committees will compile all of the bills. So the Senate Budget Committee will compile all the bills reported by the Senate reconciled committees into one omnibus bill, ditto in the House. Finally, there'll be floor consideration in the House and Senate, and amendments will be allowed. There are only 20 hours of debate, therefore it can't be filibustered. There's the vote-a-rama, which gets, as Ellen said, far more important play than it really deserves, because under the vote-a-rama, it's almost always the case that the amendments won't be allowed. And if the House and Senate end up approving reconciliation bills that aren't identical, then they need some way to solve this. Usually that's a conference agreement. More and more leadership has been involved rather than each committee doing its own thing and each chamber doing its own thing. And so the whole deals are really worked out behind the scenes in advance, in which case you don't need a conference agreement. One chamber will simply pass the agreed upon bill that the other one passed. Okay, next slide. What do we think is likely, or at least possible, in calendar year 2025 reconciliations process? First, there's an opportunity to pass 2 budget resolutions, or maybe more. The first one would be called a budget resolution for fiscal year 2025, and the second one would be called a budget resolution for fiscal year 2026, and each can have its own reconciliation directives. The first reconciliation package could be used for extending the expiring tax provisions in the ones that expire from the Trump tax cuts. They expired at the end of 2025. They could be extended and amended, and new taxes can be put in. The second reconciliation package could be used for broader spending cuts or increases, or vice versa. Republicans are undecided about what order they want to do things in and what they want to go in each package. So therefore, currently, we need to be prepared for whatever they may do. Moving on from here to the next slide. The next slide is about the Byrd Rule. It's named after the former senator from West Virginia who got upset before the rule. All sorts of stuff that he considered budgetarily inappropriate got into reconciliation bills after the rule. Stuff got in only stuff that was in violation of the rules got in only if enough people wanted them to get in. The Byrd Rule is a surgical point of order, POO, against certain provisions. Surgical means that if the provision is ruled inadmissible, then it is dropped, but the bill is not killed. It takes a 3/5 vote to waive the Byrd Rule points of order. And so therefore, if a provision that is considered inadmissible is in the bill anyhow, 3/5 of the members, 60 senators, can allow it to stay in the bill. So what are the various points of order under the Byrd Rule? First of all, each provision must be within the jurisdiction of the committee that reported that title of the reconciliation bill. Secondly, the provision must not be a cost, must not increase future deficits if the committee has violated its reconciliation target. What does that mean? Well, violating the target comes in two different ways. If the committee was allowed to increase future deficits, it will be given a number. It can't increase future deficits by more than those allowed. If the committee is told to reduce future deficits, it will be given a number, and it is not allowed to reduce the deficits by less than what is allowed. You can see that this is a one-sided rule. You can always increase deficits by less than you were allowed to. You can always cut deficits by more than you were told to. And for that reason, the provisions must not be a cost. Also, as a separate aspect, if it's a net cost in any year outside the reconciliation window, outside what we assume will be the 10-year window for the reconciliation directive and the budget resolution. In addition, you're not allowed to directly change the Social Security's budget. Can't change benefits, can't change taxes dedicated to the trust fund. And finally, each provision must score as a budget cost or saving, except that the cost or saving cannot be merely incidental. But, and this is critical, merely incidental does not mean really small. It could mean really large. This is critical, so further elaboration is needed, which is why it's useful to have Bobby here. So what are the possible, next slide, what are the possible reconciliation issues we foresee? First of all, we see that they could fund otherwise discretionary programs. Traditionally, that is not done in reconciliation, but it is not precluded under the Byrd Rule or other rules. And there is precedent. In the Inflation Reduction Act, a reconciliation bill, the IRS was granted a $79.6 billion lump sum usable over the subsequent 9 years for increased enforcement services, technology improvements, and so on. Well, IRS funding is discretionary in the sense that it goes through the annual appropriations process. The word discretionary means that it's within the legal discretion of the Appropriations Committee to decide how much. Here, we've gone around the Appropriations Committee and added some money anyhow. Different issue. A reconciliation bill cannot include emergency designations because that's a budget process issue. The emergency designation doesn't score. But because you can't include emergency designations, that means that everything in the reconciliation bill that costs money will end up going on the statutory pay-go scorecard. Everything that saves money will also go on the statutory pay-go scorecard. But if you do more costs than savings, and it really seems likely, given that the Republicans want to cut future taxes by at least $4 trillion over the decade, merely by extending the expiring provisions in the Trump tax cut. it seems really likely that they're going to end up putting costs on the statutory pay-go. That will, in theory, lead to future sequestrations or future sequestrations being even bigger. That will need to be addressed later. You can't get around it by saying, oh, this is all an emergency. Skipping ahead, this can be a lengthy process. It can take a long time for the committees to work out all the details that they need to submit their reconciliation legislation, because it has to be fully written, drafted legislation to the budget committees. And given the small margins that Republicans have in the House and Senate, and therefore the need for them to make sure that they put together a bill that they think can pass, that can really take a long time. That's why it's important that the time period stated in the reconciliation directive is non-binding. And finally, as I mentioned before, the Byrd Rule prohibits provisions that are merely incidental. That is a judgment call that is traditionally made by the Senate parliamentarian, who therefore advises the presiding officer of the Senate on whether such a provision is or is not merely incidental, and therefore is or is not a Byrd Rule violation, and therefore, if a point of order would be made, would have to be deleted from the reconciliation bill. Those things are called bird droppings, just so that there's a little humor in here. And now I'm going to turn this over to Bobby to talk about the Byrd Rule, because that's where most of us will live and die if we haven't already lived and died with the construction of the budget resolution and the budget resolution's reconciliation directive. Bobby?
Thank you. Leo, can you go forward one slide, please? Yeah, okay, great. Hi, everyone. So my dad mentioned this, but I'm gonna, or he alluded to this, but I'm gonna really lift it up because it's one of the key parts here. The Byrd Rule is not self-enforcing. You'll hear like, oh, well, you can't do this. It violates the Byrd Rule. That doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means it needs to get taken out. So often you can put in something, and often if you put in something, you'll have a meeting with a parliamentarian, and the parliamentarian will say, no, you can't do this. You just take it out right away because you don't want the politics of putting it in and having it come out and maybe you lose your coalition. But you don't have to do that, right? So for the minimum wage, we knew that it wasn't allowed. We had a bird bath. The parliamentarian said it wasn't allowed. We kept it in. We made Republicans raise a point of order, and then we voted on whether to waive the point of order. So in order to really get something out, someone needs to raise a point of order against the provision that is offending. And then it's, my dad said it was surgical, right? It doesn't kill the whole bill. It's surgical for the provision, but you can also waive the point of order with only 60 votes. Yeah, that's, that means it probably drops out. But if you have some provision that we're really worried 7 Democrats might sign on to, that could stay in the bill. The bill is still a 51 voter. It doesn't cause the bill to all of a sudden lose its privilege and now be filibusterable. It just is in with 60 votes, right? And so in the minimum wage example, obviously we didn't get Republicans to vote for it, but had we peeled off enough Republicans to vote for it, the fact that it is against the rules, the fact that it violates the Byrd Rule, doesn't matter. What you're doing is voting on whether to waive that point of order. Okay, next slide, please, Leo. So I'm going to give some examples of merely incidental, based on how the current parliamentarian, Elizabeth McDonough, thinks about it. The global caveat here is you could just fire her, right? Her double predecessor, Bob Dove, was fired for demoted, for giving reconciliation advice that the Republicans didn't like in their 2001 reconciliation attempts. You could also just ignore her, right? The presiding officer, who will probably be J.D. Vance here, could just say, thank you, right? So she'll give some advice, say, hey, you're not allowed to do this. He'll say, thanks for the advice. Duly noted, duly ignored, and go on. She would probably resign in protest at that point, but that is absolutely a thing you can do, right? So when Rockefeller was VP in the 70s, at one point, he just ignored the parliamentarian. if we want to go into like how that all plays out and then what happens if they ignore what's the Dems attempt, like we can get to that. I think it's not really worth kind of going down that path. It's a global caveat. You can ignore the rules. You can fire the parliamentarian to get different rules. I'm going to explain the way the rules actually work right now and our current understanding. So, yeah, as my dad said, stuff has to be budgetary or a term and condition necessary to get money out the door, right? So if you're like, you want to procure some green buses, you have to define what it means to be green in order to like get some green buses. You do not have to state what sort of music the buses are going to play when they're going around. That is not a budgetary thing, and that is not a term and condition necessary to get the budget out the door, budgetary effects out the door. And then also the budgetary effects can't be merely incidental. What does that mean? God knows, it's changed over time. I'm going to tell you the way that the current parliamentarian Elizabeth thinks about this. So she nixed the minimum wage. Minimum wage has major budgetary impacts. Democrats got a score. They said, okay, it's going to change revenue because people are going to earn different amounts and more people are going to be employed here and fewer people over here. Oh, and it's going to change SNAP spending and Medicaid spending and debt spending, right? Because all these things. And so therefore it's budgetary. It had, tens of billions of dollars effect, right? And she said, I know it's budgetary, but those budgetary effects are merely incidental. Why? Because you're not changing the minimum wage to change our revenue and to change Medicaid spending. You're changing the minimum wage because you want to tell a private company what it has to do with private employees. That is not budgetary, right? Her heuristic here is, well, it's not even her heuristic. Reconciliation is about getting federal dollars in or out the door. It is, I'm going to say that again because this is the key part here. Reconciliation is about getting federal dollars in or out the door. Changing the minimum wage is not about that. It does happen. You are changing federal dollars going in and out the door, but it's not about that. It is about telling a private company what it can or can't do. It's a mandate. So Elizabeth hates private sector mandates and she uses that as a heuristic. So we did ACA Part 1 through regular order. We did ACA Part 2 through reconciliation. In Part 1, we created the individual mandate. And then when Republicans tried to repeal the individual mandate in 2015, we, Senate Dems argued, hey, you can't get rid of the individual mandate. That's private sector stuff. Now, I actually think she was wrong about this. The whole point of the private, we were buying, we were giving people health insurance. And the whole point of the mandate was to stop a death spiral. So it was to prevent the federal costs from getting out of bounds. So I actually think the individual mandate was about the federal costs, even though we were doing a mandate on it. But regardless, she says, yeah, no mandates, right? Like that's not like you're telling a private company what it can and can't do. It's not about the dollar effects. And so what did Republicans do in 2017? They couldn't repeal it. They could set the penalty down to zero. So the individual mandate is still there. It is illegal to not buy health insurance. And there's a $0 fine, a penalty if you don't do it. Pathways to legalization. Dems tried tons of different ways of legalizing different groups. In BBB, I get the ARP and I forget the two ones we did mixed up, but I think it was in our House BBB version. We tried tons of different legalization, and for the same reason that Liz nixed the minimum wage, she nixed the pathways to legalization. She says, "Don't tell me that you right." So okay, so you change legalization, you're changing benefits, you're changing taxes. A lot of undocumented immigrants, pay taxes nonetheless, don't collect benefits, but some of them don't. And you make them all legal, you're gonna change revenue, and you're sure gonna change benefits. And Liz says, don't tell me you're legalizing people to change benefits. If you really wanted to change benefits, you could just change benefits. You could just make it so undocumented people could get Medicare. That's not what you're doing. You're trying to make them legal, right? That's what you're doing. It's not about the budgetary effects. It's about making them legal. That's why she says no to pathways to legalization. So there's that concept of merely incidental. She also has another heuristic about being can we go back, Leo? So she has another concept, which is if stuff is too narrowly targeted, then that proves that you are not thinking about the budgetary impact, but instead the policy impact. I think I support Liz. I think she gets too much flack, but I think one of her problems is she invents a heuristic and then she gets stuck on applying the heuristic instead of thinking about whether the individual thing makes sense. But anyway, I'm going to explain now like her heuristic of too targeted. So she doesn't like it when you affect literally one thing. So Republicans wanted to defund Planned Parenthood, and they wrote a provision where it's like, oh, if the organization looks like this and it's at least this size, but not this size, and exists this way, and this many employees, and blah 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 blah, then you can't get the federal funding. And it turned out they wrote a provision that only affected Medicaid. It's true, we changed federal dollars and cents, but Medicaid only affected Planned Parenthood. It's true, we changed federal dollars and cents, but they only changed Planned Parenthood. Dems successfully fought and and they weren't allowed to do that. Then Republicans tweaked it to change the kind of definition to allegedly, according to them, hit a second organization. And the list says, okay, that's fine, right? So her rule is if you're doing a one thing, it's not okay. If you're doing two, it's probably okay. So similarly in the tax bill, we won on like two things. And one of the ones was that Mitch McConnell was going to do a special carve out just for one college in his home state of Kentucky, right? He was going to help Berea College. That was birded out, right? Like that was not allowed. It's too targeted. And then finally, I'm going to use one. This is from Liz's predecessor, Fruman. But so Alan, Republicans wanted to split the Ninth Circuit in reconciliation, and that they're constitutional officers who mentioned in the Constitution. It's an entitlement spending. It creates automatic spending. Creating new federal workers is exactly the sort of thing you're supposed to be able to do in reconciliation. So I think he was probably wrong about this. But he says you're not trying to do this because you're trying to do new federal spending. You're trying to change the partisan composition of a court. Like, you got to be kidding me. So that wasn't allowed. I'm now. Can we go to the next one, Leo? Thank you. So I'm now gonna like use this type of thinking to go through what we know and try to apply that and kind of talk you through. So Republicans are talking about doing defense increases. Well, that's allowed, right? It's like funding, buying more ships to go play battleships in the ocean or whatever. Hiring more people, like more soldiers, military personnel. That is about getting federal dollars and cents out the door or in the door, right? That's what it is. That's obviously allowed. You're obviously allowed to just like fund more people and more stuff. Now, reconciliation, you probably can't put all the bells and whistles to say it must be, like when you try to kind of limit it in two ways, Liz is going to get unhappy. But if they want to give broad authority and be like, oh yeah, DOD is going to hire some people to do whatever, that's totally fine. Similarly, building a wall. You are paying the federal government is building a federal thing with federal dollars. That is budgetary. Similarly, funding like a deportation squad, right? Like pumping up a lot of money into ICE. That's the same thing. You're hiring federal workers to do an activity. That is fundamentally budgetary. Asterisk, that will create a long-term deficit point of order. CBO does a partial dynamic score of immigration bills if they affect the population enough. And that's a close held secret of what enough is. But trust me, funding a deportation squad the type they want to do is enough. So they'll do a partial dynamic score, which would cause them to lose revenue. And you can't just sunset it, right? Like, because those revenues are lost for forever. So they will then run into a long-term budget point of order. As my dad says, you can't do long-term deficits. So you have to find a way to pay for that. That's solvable, but it means if they want to do this, they need like a perma tax increase or a perma spending cut to kind of make this work. Changes to immigration law, largely not allowed, right? So we couldn't do naturalization. It's the same sort of thing, right? I'm sure they can find ways to do a little bit here and there, right? So like in 2022, they found a way to sneakily extend Title 40. It didn't pass, right? But they found a way to like sneakily extend Title 42 for like 120 days. But most of what they can't do is not budgetary, right? You could probably slap a fine of not too small amount, a fee for like asylum processing. If you try to do a fee of $2 million, she's going to be like, no way. Like that's a de facto ban. She doesn't allow you to shoehorn a not allowed policy in by like being like, oh, but now it's a tax or a fine. It's okay. Like if you do a $2 million fee, on applying for a visa that's not okay because it's a ban by another means. But like, most of the stuff they won't be able to do. They'll have some narrow wins, but most of it they ought not to be allowed to do. But even if they did, it would have the same deficit issues. Can I get the next slide, Leo? Thank you very much. Most tax changes are allowed, right? So what they, Trump tax cuts were written in reconciliation. Bush tax cuts were written in reconciliation. ACA tax increases were written in reconciliation. Clinton tax increases were written in reconciliation. Most tax changes you can do. You can't cheese it. You can't find a way to do a ban through the tax code. You do a 3,000% tax on something, that's not okay. But like most tax changes, tariffs, I don't think they have the votes to do tariffs through reconciliation, but like that sort of thing would be allowed as long as it's not considered like too much or whatever. So for the same reason, therefore, repealing the IRA credits would be allowed, right? That was done in reconciliation. You can take it out. I don't have it on the slide, but similarly, getting rid of the IRS funding, right, that we did in IRA, you can get rid of in reconciliation. And more drilling, who knows? They did it in 2017 in reconciliation, so that you'd think they ought to be able to. The parliamentarian kind of did an offhand comment in 2021, being like, oh, maybe I wrongly decided that. So who's to say? She's been kind of narrowing her idea of what is allowed in reconciliation, just like more and more and more. So it just gets more and more narrow, like what's merely incidental. I think Anwar drilling is exactly the sort of thing you ought to be able to do. You're selling federal stuff for money. Like that's obviously budgetary. But she has her heuristics and works off of them. Permitting reform, most of it probably not allowed. It's not really budgetary or a necessary term and condition. I'm sure they can find small things and then claim a victory, right? It's like, I did it, I fixed it. But like the broad stuff they want to do is largely not allowed. He could kill the save plan, right? Like that's the sort of thing that they can do. I mean, we created switching from guaranteed loans to direct student loans, and we created a Pell entitlement. This is fundamentally budgetary stuff that you'd be killing. So a lot of what they want to do, or that they've said they want to do, is doable. Now that makes sense because they're not going to be lifting up stuff that they can't do. But it's just to say there's very real stuff. There are very real limitations of what they can't do, right? They can't do most of their worst anti-immigration stuff, but they can do a lot of bad anti-immigration stuff, right? And this is kind of true broadly. So I'm going to end it here. And we should open up for questions.
My goodness, thank you both so much. Yeah, I think Leo, you can take the slides down so we can see folks. So let me say at the outset that you heard a lot of complicated rules real fast. Please understand that this is the start of our sharing of information process, not the end. And everybody who is registered for this webinar will get, of course, the follow-up information tomorrow, but we will also keep you on a list so that as we learn more, you'll hear more. We will doubtless have more webinars, but we want you to understand that this is the start of a process, and a lot of this is complicated. Let's see. So I guess there are a gang of questions, many of which our speakers quickly were replying to in the Q&A box. We will include their replies in the follow-up email, as well as all the other stuff, so you can have that. And I'm not sure I'm going to get at all of this in the best order, but someone asked for more explanation of certain terms: emergency designation, statutory PAYGO scorecard, potential sequestration. I'm just going to turn that over to Richard or Bobby to kind of go over some of that for people to get a better sense of what you mean by those things.
So I got the question. I typed in an answer, but let me give it back briefly. The Statutory PAYGO Act of 2010, and previous PAYGO law first enacted in 1990, said that tax or mandatory spending legislation that is enacted by Congress has to go on a scorecard that OMB maintains. And if the net in any given year of costs and savings is a net cost, then a list of all entitlements except those on an exemption list, which actually is many of them, must get automatically cut by enough to offset the net costs on the scorecard. Okay, that's bad if you're doing across the board cuts on lots of existing entitlements. The idea back when these things were enacted that this would be a disincentive to enact legislation that has tax and entitlement legislation that was a net cost. Turns out this doesn't work. Congress enacts these things regularly anyhow. An example was the Bush tax cuts. Another example is the Trump tax cuts. An example where was the rescue plan. Another example was the Inflation Reduction Act. These are net costs. Their costs went on the PAYGO scorecard and would have led to these unhappy, unfortunate sequestrations that neither party wanted. And so therefore, in later in the session before the sequestrations would have been triggered at the end of the session, Congress simply passed another law saying to OMB, don't do it. The usual form was take those costs off the scorecard. And this is going to happen this time too, if the Republicans enact net costs, and given that they want to raise lower taxes by at least $4 trillion by extending the Trump tax cuts for a decade, sounds like they want to do this. I personally said I'm not too worried about it, given the history of never having any of these sequestration actually occur. Congress always passes law turning them off before they would occur.
And just to clarify, sequestration, it would be across the board cuts that would be imposed if they have spent more, right, than they were supposed to. But you're saying that Congress doesn't usually like to see that happen and will say that it shouldn't. So thank you for that. I want to turn to Ellen right now because of one thing that she, two related questions really, an opportunity for advocates to engage when the budget resolution is still at the budget committee, or you correct me if that isn't exactly what you wanted to talk about. But the question was also asked, you know, what process points are key opportunities for state grassroots to influence the content of reconciliation bills before they hit the floor? Those are not totally unrelated points. So Ellen, take it away.
So the first one is maybe a little bit less about advocates and more about the kinds of things that Richard and Bobby and Meredith and Debbie and I will do. So the budget markup of the budget resolution, those are foregone conclusions, right? They're going to put a resolution in front of the Senate Budget Committee with a narrow margin of Republicans over Democrats. And in the House, they'll do the same thing. They're going to lay down a budget resolution. One of the really important exercises that sometimes, not always, can produce more information is that then there is a lengthy process where the staff of the majority have to explain what's in the resolution, answer questions. We have used that process in many, many moments to ferret out information about what was assumed in X program or Y, or what program is being on the table, or what does this mean? So one of the exercises, and again, we can't promise it will work, but one of the exercises that a few of us will engage in, and the Democrats will be all over this, is to ask a lot of questions in hopes of getting more information. And also, it is the place where the debate on the entire reconciliation thing starts. It is an opportunity for Democrats to be lifting up what are the harmful cuts and changes that Republicans are planning on make. How much are they planning on blowing a hole in the deficit by allowing an increase in the deficit of some ungodly amount, for the tax cut bill? In reconciliation, when it comes to reconciling tax cuts, unlike Debbie being the chair of Energy and Commerce, and we're going to assign her, maybe minus 350 billion or whatever it is, for the tax committees, they are allowed, their instruction is giving them permission to increase the deficit by a certain amount, a certain net amount. So that is going to tell us, by and large, the size of the tax cuts that they're unpaid for tax cuts that they're allowing themselves to do as they're making cuts. So the budget committee, this is why I was saying we don't have to wait till see the reconciliation bill to start engaging and lifting up what are they planning on going after and starting to lay out. Now, they may not answer the question, where do you think you're getting that $300 billion savings in Medicaid? What are the specific changes, Mr. Chairman, that you envision? Have you and Mr. Guthrie, the chair of the Energy and Commerce next year, what changes have the two of you agreed to? If you were them, you wouldn't answer the question. But that also gives us, frankly, a little bit of license that we won't have when they do a bill. They can't say then that they're not taking benefits away from people. They can't say that they're not going to be hurting providers. They can't say that they're not shifting costs to states. So we can't run state by state numbers on an assumption of a cut in a budget resolution, but we can list out all the ways it would hurt states and all the ways it would hurt people who rely on Medicaid. So that budget resolution, again, is the kickoff point for us in terms of education and engagement and advocacy. So I just wanted to kind of flag that. I think that is a point, obviously, the first point around the budget resolution. I do want to remind us that while there's not much left in the session, we have numerous quotes to point to from Republicans right now saying we are going to make, or we should make cuts in Medicaid and SNAP. We have a statement from the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, Lindsey Graham, this week saying we should pass border and we need to find offsets to pay for the money we're going to put into border. Those are the things that we can use to say it isn't that the Center on Budget and CAP and CHN are worried that they might do this. They are themselves telling us that they're looking at these cuts. So now, as Republicans are meeting, which the press reports almost on a daily basis, as Republicans are meeting to decide what their policy goals are, to decide what they're going to do in reconciliation, now is the time, like now in December, to be using whatever strategies and tactics we can to bring pressure on moderate Republicans in the House and Senate to say you need to be going to your leadership and saying, I don't want to vote for Medicaid cuts. I don't want to vote for something that takes away nutrition assistance and health care for people. And to try now to make this very difficult for them to go after these low-income entitlements.
Okay, we are running low on time. I know we won't get to every question. There is a question, you, Richard, and probably Bobby too, have talked about Social Security is not supposed to be dealt with in reconciliation. The president elect has called for Social Security tax reductions for some folks. Would that be allowable, or is that off the table in reconciliation?
I can
Let me-
take that unless you want it.
I sort of would like it.
Okay, it's yours.
Because I've thought about this a lot. We don't know the answer. I do know what I think should be the answer. Under the Budget Act, because Social Security is not stuff you're supposed to do in budget resolutions and reconciliation and legislation that's subject to the Budget Act. Therefore, only on budget affects cost. The on budget effects of such a proposal would be to reduce revenue. And since under existing law, all that revenue is then sent from the tax revenue from the taxation of benefits is sent to the Social Security Trust Fund, there would be that revenue would go away. Therefore, the spending of that revenue to send it from the Treasury to the Social Security Trust Fund would go away. So the net on budget effect is zero. And provisions that don't score are bird rule violations. I think that should be the answer. But we've never had anything like that, anything that doesn't score for that reason. CBO and JCT would say, well, here's the revenue effect and here's the spending effect netting to zero from a single provision. And maybe the parliamentarian will say, oh, well, those are two separate effects, each of which does score. I don't know. Because there is no precedent, I don't think we can be definitive about this. Bobby, what do you think?
I think you can probably do it. Because I mean, you're not amending Title II of the Social Security Act, you're amending the income tax code. That whole thing couldn't have been created in reconciliation, but given that like what you can definitely do is say, hey, this stuff is subject to taxation. Like that's a normal thing that reconciliation can do. The fact that it's social security benefits that are subject to taxation and that therefore it's a de facto kind of cut in your benefit is kind of neither here nor there. You're just saying this stuff counts as income. That's fundamentally like normal tax code stuff. What you totally couldn't have done in reconciliation was create then the transfer over to the fund. But given that that already exists and you're not messing with the transfer, you're just getting rid of the money that goes into the transfer. I think that's like comparable to the way that she thinks about the individual mandate. You couldn't repeal the mandate, but given that the mandate's already there, you can muck with the stuff going in and out of the mandate. So my gut is you can probably do this. That said, it creates a 60 vote budget point of order that they need to figure out how to deal with. So while I think that it doesn't actually run afoul of the bird rule, I think they then run into a whole different issue that they need to figure out how to deal with, and which is a whole separate question.
And that point of order
Is nuclear.
Is nuclear,
Yeah,
which
it would kill the
means that
whole
if it
bill.
goes the wrong way, it kills the entire reconciliation bill. So these are various perfectly reasonable arguments on both sides by people who have sunk into this stuff too much, too long. And we didn't actually come to a clear answer, I think.
Well, I mean, that's an important message here. We are a little over time. So, Leo, actually, can you put up that slide about the next webinar? That we're not sure of how a lot of this will proceed, and that's why we need to keep talking to each other, sharing information as we get it. I appreciate everyone's willingness to start this process of educating ourselves, and especially appreciate Richard and Bobby and Ellen's help with this. There is one next step that we're just starting to get the word out about. We will have a webinar on January 7th, 2025, not with this kind of technical presentation, but we're calling it our path forward. And I think you're getting the registration link on the chat side, but tomorrow everyone will get it. This is a webinar we really hope for a very broad audience, advocates, state and local, all across the nation. So we're hoping that you will forward word about it. When we send the follow-up around, you'll see all the speakers, but they include Dorian Warren from Community Change, Linda Spears, CEO of Child Welfare League of America, many others who will talk about immigration crises in front of us, how we can work together on them, tax justice issues. There'll be a lot for everyone in that webinar. So I did want to make sure you knew about that. I'm trying to think if there is one final question. I guess it's kind of a combo question, which is a lot of questions were asked. Well, maybe the president's going to be declared immune from everything by the Supreme Court, and maybe they can do all kinds of things that are contrary to what we think of as the law, whether impoundment or other aspects of what works or not in reconciliation. This is very broad, but Richard or Bobby, are there constraints that you would anticipate working to prevent outright illegality? Hey, Tuffy.
Okay, you really asked that. I am not a lawyer. Um, and I'm sort of grateful that I'm not a lawyer. Um, People that I know who are good lawyers say that under the way courts have always ruled in the past, if the government takes an illegal action and that has an adverse effect on a person who therefore has standing. Let us talk about impoundment, money that under the law this person was supposed to get, that person can sue. The lawyer who said this to me said the courts will presumably rule in favor of that person getting the money. It doesn't matter whether they think that Trump goes to jail or doesn't go to jail. What matters in this case is that they order the budget person for the agency to release the funds. And it's a court order that is in effect leads to the sort of thing that happens when you're violating court rules. When the judge says you need to shut up in court, or this or that or the other thing, courts can order you jailed until you follow their orders. This means that the money basically will be released. It's not a
That's
Trump thing.
helpful.
It's not a Trump thing. It's about staffers being told they will be locked up unless they follow what the court orders.
Can I,
So presuming that the courts don't change the way they think about impoundment, then illegal impoundments will lead to the money ultimately being released. There are lots of problems there. What's an illegal versus illegal impoundment, and what does the word ultimately mean? But I don't think that the status of the president is at issue. At least that's what I've been told.
can
Yeah,
I
we
just
do
say
have to
one quick
close,
thing?
but
Oh,
Bob, sure, go ahead, Bobby, and then we'll close.
I think that's all right. I don't think what I'm about to say is going to happen, but you can imagine a scenario where you actually have a maximalist like Trump fighting back against it. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is they'll lose in the courts, and then everything will get worked out with a lot of chaos and a lot of harm along the way, but that'll all get worked out. But you could imagine a scenario where the courts say do this or else you're going to jail, and then Trump is trying to pardon them or whatever, right? Or all of a sudden he's scheduling effing the people saying I'm going to fire you unless you do it, and then getting his lackey, right? So like you could imagine actually a cascading fight. I don't think that any of that is going to happen. But like a maximalist, like our system is not set up to deal with someone who is intent on abusing the system. And so a maximalist abuse system could go in directions that no one's really thinking about.
Okay, you can give that very last slide, Leo. I don't know if that was entirely the up moment we should have been ending on. We know we're up against it. We're so grateful to Richard, to Ellen, to Bobby for their insights and knowledge. We know we have a lot to get under our belts, so you'll get more information from us tomorrow. But we do want to wish you happy holidays. Rest up. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, as you've just heard about. Thank you all so much. I think that concludes us.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.